He made the whole world believe that a song could teach people how to stand back up after losing hand after hand, but few ever knew that he himself carried emotional debts he could never repay. Kenny Rogers, the legendary The Gambler, the man whose voice sounded like advice from someone who had already survived the storm, lived a life filled with quiet fractures. He was born into poverty in Houston, raised on dinners that were nothing but bread and peanut butter in the cramped public housing blocks of San Felipe Courts. But the haunting wasn't only the hunger. It was an alcoholic father, leaving Kenny with a fear so deeply inherited that he spent his entire life refusing to touch alcohol, as if a single sip could make everything collapse. From a young man playing music in small clubs, Kenny pushed through every genre, every group, every rejection, dismissed for being too old, until he finally reached the peak, selling over 100 million records, turning the gambler into a phrase America repeated like a proverb, and making the whole world sing along to Islands in the Stream with Dolly Parton. But behind the gentle gray beard were 5 marriages, repeated departures from family life, children who grew up inside an absence, and one of the most painful confessions of all, that some victories were bought with a price no amount of money could ever restore. Step into the true story of Kenny Rogers, where talent, tragedy, and life's contradictions begin right here. And to understand how a man could sing about life lessons as if he had already walked through every crossroads, we have to return to where Kenny Rogers began. A place with no spotlight, no stage, only the damp smell of cramped rooms and the weight of deprivation pressing down on childhood like fate. Kenny Rogers was born on August 21, 1938, in Houston, Texas. His full name was Kenneth Donald Rogers. He was the 4th of 8 children, so many that silence in that household was almost a luxury. His mother, Lucille, worked as a nurse's assistant. His father, Edward, was a carpenter. Money was always tight, and that kind of shortage wasn't the kind where you simply couldn't buy what you wanted. It was the kind that sometimes reduced dinner to nothing more than bread and peanut butter, enough to stay full for a moment, but never enough to give a child a complete childhood. They lived in San Felipe Courts, a crowded public housing project where poverty wasn't a phase. It was the air itself. But what forced Kenny to grow up early wasn't only the poverty. Inside that home was another kind of instability. His father struggled with alcohol, and that darkness seeped into Kenny's memory like ink that never fades. That child never had the right to choose the world he was born into. He could only learn how to endure, learn to stay quiet when adults collapsed, learn to watch closely when the happiness in the house lasted no longer than a single breath. Later, when Kenny became a man, he developed a nearly absolute reflex. He stayed away from alcohol his entire life, as if touching it would mean touching the fear of his childhood again. Kenny attended Wharton Elementary, then George Washington Junior High, and graduated from Jefferson Davis High School in 1956, a milestone that mattered because in his family he was the first to finish high school. But that diploma didn't make life easier overnight. Kenny still had to take on every kind of small job to help support the family, sweeping floors in a hat shop for a meager wage, working as a busboy at the Rice Hotel, earning money bit by bit, the way a poor boy learns to stand on his own 2 feet. It was during those days of studying and working at the same time that music began to grow inside him, quietly. In 1949, Kenny won a talent contest at the Texan Theater, an early sign that there was something inside that skinny boy stronger than his circumstances. And then, with money saved little by little, he bought his first guitar. It wasn't just an instrument, it was an escape route. In a neighborhood where trouble was always waiting around the corner, Kenny chose music as a way to save himself before life could swallow him whole. And when a child grows up in deprivation, the first thing he learns is not how to dream, but how to cling to something so he doesn't break. For Kenny Rogers, that something was music. Not romantic, not weightless, but like a real-life preserver. He didn't enter the business through glory. He entered through attempts and failures, nights of playing like hired labor and a stubborn toughness that only belongs to someone who has tasted poverty up close. Even in high school, Kenny refused to stand still. He formed a small band with friends and gave it a proudly ambitious name, the Scholars. Almost funny because none of them were exactly academic stars, yet it sounded like a declaration. They might not have grades, but they had rhythm and nerve. They recorded a song called Poor Little Doggy, selling about 3,000 copies around Houston. That number didn't turn anyone into a star, but for Kenny, it was the first proof that his voice could change his life. People started noticing something unusual. Kenny looked camera-ready. Some faces are born for the stage, and Kenny was one of them, even when he still didn't have spare money to his name. In 1957, he released that Crazy Feeling and unexpectedly made local noise. That recording was like a small but unmistakable knock on the door. Kenny had reached the public. And then came the moment every young singer dreams of. February 15, 1958, Kenny appeared on American Bandstand. Getting on that show wasn't just being on TV. It was a passport that proved he was no longer a name confined to Houston. Even though the song didn't climb very high nationally, Kenny secured the most important thing. The spotlight didn't scare him. It made him feel alive. But life didn't swing the big doors open right away. After that first touch of light came a long stretch of the hardest road an artist can walk, playing for survival, trying anything that could keep him afloat. He joined Bobby Doyle 3, a jazz group, working clubs like a skilled tradesman, steady, disciplined, and often invisible. No one applauded because of the name Kenny Rogers. They applauded because the music was good that night, and Kenny understood. If he wanted to last, he had to build toughness from the inside out. No being picky, no wounded pride, no childish fantasy that talent alone would earn him a launch pad. He began doing the kinds of work most audiences never hear about. Playing bass, writing music, producing, becoming the man behind other artists. For a time, Kenny was like a craftsman in a music factory, assembling small pieces in exchange for experience and just enough money to keep breathing. And that's where a quiet contradiction formed inside him. Kenny wanted to be seen, yet he was forced to get used to being overlooked. Kenny had a gift for singing, yet he had to earn his living through roles no one remembers. In 1966, he recorded Here's That Rainy Day with Mercury Records, and it failed. A failed recording might sound minor, but to Kenny, it was the kind of failure that makes you ask, am I on the wrong road? Am I too small? But he reacted in the most Kenny way possible. He didn't shatter. He simply shifted direction in silence. If one door closed, he would try another. And if the world couldn't hear him through a solo record, he would enter the business through the longer road, singing, playing, working, surviving, until the spotlight could no longer ignore him. That failure pushed him toward a decision that felt almost instinctive. If the solo path only brought locked doors, then he would crawl through any door that was still lit, as long as it placed him closer to music, closer to the stage, and most of all, closer to a chance at survival. On May 3, 1966, Kenny carried his stand-up bass into a rehearsal with the new Christy Minstrels, a massive folk collective. So large, it barely felt like a band and more like an image-making machine. There, Kenny tasted what he had always craved. Big stages, big television, huge audiences, lights strong enough to make a man believe his career had clicked into place. But the lights came with rules as cold as steel. Shave the beard, wear the uniform, sing what you're assigned, smile on cue. Kenny learned the cruel paradox quickly. Fame does not mean you get to be yourself. He stood on television, but the power to choose belonged to someone else. He sang for millions, yet inside, it felt like being a hired man forced to wear a mask. And there was something that choked him even more than image control: money. Kenny watched the machine roar, albums selling, shows stacked one after another, yet the artists' lives inside that system did not change the way people imagined. There was no creative freedom, no control over the music, no clear financial future. The only thing he could truly feel was this: if he stayed, he would be ground down into an anonymous voice inside an oversized collective. And for a man who had clung to music to escape poverty, being stripped of ownership felt like being dragged right back into the old poverty cycle. Except this time, it was poverty under bright lights. After only a year, Kenny couldn't take it anymore. On April 10, 1967, he left with several members and formed the First Edition, a move that carried the breath of real, reckless risk. Kenny poured in his own money, bought equipment himself, started over like a man who had accepted a brutal truth. Better to be broke and free than fed, but silenced. And in that period, Kenny's image shifted sharply. Longer hair, rougher presence, eyes no longer well-behaved for a television frame. He didn't need to look polished. He needed to look like a man ready to gamble. They signed with Reprise, and then the unthinkable happened. In 1968, just dropped in to see what condition. My condition was in, exploded like a collective hallucination. Strange psychedelic sounds, lyrics that felt delirious, music that hovered between satire and confusion. The kind of song that, coming from the man who would later become a country gentleman, feels like fate playing a cruel joke. But that contradiction is exactly the point. Kenny was never a star born on a straight line. He was a man constantly shape-shifting just to stay alive. And that song became proof that Kenny had truly broken out in a way no one predicted. So much so that years later it would re-enter pop culture through the Big Lebowski, like a fingerprint reminding the world that Kenny once had a rebellion inside him. Then the First Edition slowly drifted toward country, not because they were forced, but because Kenny finally found the land that matched his instinct for storytelling. Songs like Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town, and Reuben James pulled the band away from psychedelic oddity and into something more haunting. Everyday stories, painful stories, stories that smelled real, stories of the forgotten. Kenny stood at the center like a man who had escaped the minstrel's cage and now learned how to turn life into song, turn wounds into something that could sell tickets, but could also make listeners choke in silence. And when the First Edition began leaning fully into stories of real life, into the scratches and bruises of human truth, Kenny was simultaneously stepping onto another rung: mass appeal. They were no longer a strange band reserved for psychedelic audiences. Little by little, they became a name that could appear right inside America's living rooms. In 1971, the band even had its own television program, Rolling on the River, the kind of show that, once it airs regularly, turns you from a musician into a familiar face. There, Kenny didn't just sing. He learned how to stand in front of the camera like a storyteller, knowing when to smile, when to drop a line with just enough charm, and when to turn a performance into something that felt intimate and familiar. For many artists, television is a reward. For Kenny, it was also training, teaching him how to control the public's breathing, how to hold attention without forcing it. But that popularity came with a quiet. reality that slowly tightened around his throat. The more mainstream you become, the more you are pushed into compromise. The bigger the band, the harder the industry machine pulls you in. Packed schedules, musical decisions bent by market taste, egos inside the group colliding like stones. By 1975, the first edition fell apart, and Kenny understood it the way a man does when he has turned too many times just to survive. If he kept moving with the crowd, he would always remain only part of a collective, always forced to divide his identity into meetings, negotiations, and fights over spotlight. So he made a decision many people called reckless. One last solo gamble. No backup plan, no band to hide behind. If it failed, he would drop straight to the bottom. But the cruelest blow didn't come from the audience. It came from the gatekeepers. As Kenny entered his late 30s, a record label dismissed him with a single cold cut. Too old to do country. Not because his voice was bad, not because he lacked talent, only because of age. At the very moment others would call maturity, Kenny was treated like expired merchandise. The humiliation wasn't in the wording. It was in the fact that he knew they were repeating exactly what the whole system believed. Country needed younger, newer, easier-to-sell faces. And so Kenny entered a bitter stretch, singing in small Las Vegas lounges holding about 600 seats, places bright enough that people wouldn't call it failure, but narrow enough that an artist could hear the lonely echo of his own voice. Some nights, people drank more than they listened. Some nights, Kenny looked down and knew. They didn't need Kenny Rogers. They only needed a voice to fill the air between clinking glasses. The television glory suddenly felt like a dried-up dream from another life. It was in that setting that Kenny received a push that felt almost fated. Steve Wynn looked at him and told him bluntly, "Stop locking yourself inside a small room." It wasn't a soft comfort. It was a slap meant to wake him up. Kenny was used to rejection, used to being judged, used to starting over. But he had never seen the trap so clearly until that moment. The trap wasn't that people underestimated him. It was that he was beginning to believe them. And if Kenny allowed himself to live forever inside that 600-seat room, then his whole life would become the story of a man who almost became a legend. That push exposed the truth. Kenny Rogers was not washed up. He was simply trapped in the wrong place. That 600-seat lounge in Las Vegas was like a sealed room where a master storyteller had been reduced to background music. And once he saw that trap, Kenny began doing what he had done since childhood, tearing down an old version of himself in order to rebuild a new one. No more half measures, no more detours. In 1976, the official turning point arrived with his first solo album, Love Lifted Me. It wasn't the kind of explosion that stunned America overnight, but it was a crucial marker, because for the first time, Kenny stood alone, signed his own name onto everything, and declared, "This is me, and I don't need a band to protect me anymore." After years of circling through folk, jazz, psychedelic, pop, Kenny realized the only thing that could save him was not genre, but narrative voice. Not the most beautiful voice, but the kind of voice that makes people believe he has lived exactly what he is singing. And he began rebuilding his public self around that truth. Deeper, older, more lived in, turning age into an advantage, turning years of rejection into capital. Then 1977 hit like a bullet to the heart. Lucille. This wasn't just a hit. It was the moment Kenny gave birth to the Kenny Rogers the public would later trust like a man from their own household. Lucille was built like a short story. A bar room, a confession, a man left behind, a line of dialogue as cold as a knife. Kenny didn't try to be a hero. He let his character be weak, bitter, ashamed. And that honesty is exactly what made the audience recognize themselves. When the song became a massive hit and brought him a Grammy, Kenny understood. He didn't have to chase the industry's youthful tempo anymore. He only had to tell the truth at the tempo of life. From that moment on, the style was stamped. Music as diary, lyrics as confession, melody as a sigh. But if Lucille was the birth explosion, then 1978 was the year Kenny stepped straight into legend, with a song America would later use as a life proverb, "The Gambler." The frightening part is that it didn't merely become famous, it got absorbed into everyday language. People repeated, "Know when to hold 'em," like a moral lesson, using it to talk about love, money, marriage, even ethical choices. Kenny was no longer just a singer. He became a national storyteller, the kind of man who only had to open his mouth and people automatically sat down to listen. The album, The Gambler, became a cultural milestone not only because of sales or charts, but because it redefined what a seasoned man could look like in mainstream country music. And Kenny was smart enough not to stop at one song. He turned it into a living character through the television movie series, The Gambler. By stepping onto the screen in the leading role, Kenny did something extremely rare. He carried an entire musical persona into film without making it feel fake. The sequels followed one after another, with even an Emmy nomination, stretching into a multi-part series, until The Gambler was no longer a 3-minute song, but a cultural universe where Kenny Rogers was simultaneously a singer, a television face, and an icon of the rugged man with a code. People didn't just listen to Kenny, they looked at him and believed he truly was that man. At the same time, he pulled off a subtle breakthrough, crossing over without being hated for it. With Lady, written by Lionel Richie, Kenny stepped cleanly across the country pop border. At that time, many country artists were accused of betrayal the moment they softened or went mainstream. But Kenny passed through because he never changed the core. He still told stories, still carried decency inside the voice. Lady made him a name even non-country listeners couldn't ignore. And once he stood at that border, he stepped even deeper into history with a collaboration that became legendary. In 1983 came Islands in the Stream with Dolly Parton. It wasn't just a successful duet, it became a symbol of something rare in show business, two massive stars standing side by side without needing to swallow each other's light. On stage, audiences always want to believe there is romance, but their real power came from something sturdier. A friendship long enough to make. People feel comforted simply by watching them smile together. Islands in the Stream moved beyond music. It became the image of a warm, optimistic America that still believed in kindness. And Kenny received the full glow of that gentle halo. From the late 70s into the 80s, and then across decades, Kenny didn't just have hits. He had reach. He sold over 120 million records worldwide, ranking among the best-selling male artists in history. And what mattered even more was that his audience did not belong to one generation. Older listeners heard him and felt their lives being spoken for. Younger listeners heard him and learned what emotion sounds like when it doesn't need to scream. He won 3 Grammys and countless honors from CMA and ACM. But awards were only the surface. The deeper achievement was this. Kenny built a public image that almost no one in entertainment can truly manage. Gentle but not bland, famous but not threatening, experienced without preaching. A face the public could trust, even if they knew nothing about the sleepless nights, the cracked marriages, or the cost of always appearing strong. And precisely because of that, the higher Kenny rose, the more he had to live inside a painful Contradiction he could never say out loud. The more people loved him as a steady man, the more he had to hide the unsteady parts of his own life to keep that image from breaking. The more he was called a legend, the more he was forced to look like a legend every time he stepped into the light. Even on days when the body hurt, the heart was exhausted, and deep inside, he no longer knew how long he could keep holding himself together. And after carrying that steady, reliable image on his shoulders for so long, Kenny Rogers came to understand one thing. If he stayed frozen in the role of a storytelling singer, time would eventually swallow him whole. So he began expanding his territory in a way that was unmistakably Kenny. No noise, no showmanship. But wherever he went, he left behind the same feeling of trust, like a man who had lived enough that he no longer needed to prove anything. He stepped into acting and television as if he were simply walking into another room of the same house. Six Pack proved that Kenny could bring that father figure, big brother charisma to the screen without forcing it. Then the Gambler franchise turned him into a familiar face on American TV. Not the kind of star who flares up and disappears, but the kind of household presence. You turn on the television, you see him, you feel reassured. Even projects like McShane continued to strengthen that perception. Kenny didn't need to overact. He only needed to appear in that calm, grounded posture, and the audience would automatically place their trust in him. In an industry where television is always hungry for stable characters to hold viewers, Kenny seemed almost born for that function. He lasted on screen not because of tricks, but because the public had grown used to thinking of him as an anchor. But at the same time, he carried another ambition, one that didn't live on stage. In the early 1990s, when many artists of his generation were simply trying to protect their hit-making legacy, Kenny wanted to prove he wasn't confined to applause. In 1991, he launched Kenny Rogers Roasters, choosing a strikingly down-to-earth direction, rotisserie chicken, a scent of warm kitchen comfort that matched his image so perfectly it felt almost inevitable. At first, everything exploded like a craze. People came in out of curiosity, then returned for the familiar comfort, the same way they returned to Kenny's songs. But business is not like music. An audience can forgive a failed album, the market will not. Competition tightened, costs pressed down, legal disputes closed in, and the brand slowly collapsed in America like a long slide, forcing Kenny to swallow the bitter feeling of someone who had won so much, yet could still lose. And the irony was sharp. While the name was labeled a failure at home, it kept living on stubbornly in Asia and Southeast Asia, as if fate itself wanted to prove that Kenny still had global pull, just in a way no one could have predicted. And then, after those experiments, he returned to the one thing that had kept him alive, the stage. But now the stage was no longer a place to prove himself. It was a place to hold on to what remained of life. In 2006, the album Water and Bridges still made the charts, like a quiet confirmation that he had never truly ended. By then, Kenny wasn't chasing trends anymore. He was making music like a man writing letters back to himself. And as the years went on, the cost of decades on the road began to show on his body. Fatigue, pain, strength, wearing away little by little. By 2017, he chose to step back on his own terms with a farewell tour titled The Gambler's Last Deal, a name that sounded like a confession, the final hand. Not because he loved his audience any less, but because he knew he could not stand on stage at half quality. In 2018, the canceled shows began to appear, no longer as rumor, but as a clear sign that his body was finally saying what Kenny had always kept hidden. Even that unshakable man was reaching his limit. When Kenny began having to cancel shows for health reasons, people finally saw a cruel truth more clearly. The price he paid wasn't only a body worn down by 6 decades on the road, but relationships that had started cracking long before, back when he hadn't even become Kenny Rogers in the public memory yet. If you strip away the spotlight, the deepest pain isn't the fading lights. It's his first marriage, the place where he learned, for the first time, how a dream can consume an entire family. Janice Gordon came into Kenny's life when he was still a deprived Houston boy, holding his guitar like a lifeline. Their love was young and real. Janice believed love could make people grow up, while Kenny had only raw passion and simple promises at 19. On May 15, 1958, just 3 months after Kenny appeared on American Bandstand with That Crazy Feeling, they rushed into a courthouse wedding in Houston. Janice was only 18, 3 months pregnant. Kenny was 19, so broke he had to borrow $75 just to complete the paperwork. He wore his only suit and then went back to working warehouse shifts, as if the wedding was simply something that had to be done in time. On September 15, 1958, their daughter Carol Lynn was born. Kenny worked the warehouse by day and chased gigs at night, squeezing $15 shows in between a baby's cries and the cost of diapers and milk. No one was wrong. There was simply too much poverty, too much exhaustion. Janice needed a husband at home. Kenny believed the only way to save the family was to chase opportunity outside. Janice's family looked at him like a gamble. Her mother cut out job ads and placed them in front of Kenny like an ultimatum. At Christmas, they gave him a framed band photo, then never hung it, and they declared that if he didn't have stable income within a year, Janice would have to come home. The marriage was slowly ground down by sleeplessness, money stress, wounded pride, and the constant feeling of being judged. The more Kenny was pressured, the more he stayed away from home, trying to prove himself. In October 1959, after a fight, Kenny stepped outside to cool off. When he returned, the house was empty. Janice had left with her mother, taking every trace of their home with her. In April 1960, they divorced, only 686 days after the wedding. And then came the real tragedy. Kenny toured with the Bobby Doyle Trio, playing 6 nights a week, earning about $55 per show, then spending almost all of it on motels and the road. Music became the place he hid in so he wouldn't collapse. Janice remarried in 1961 to a more stable man. Kenny signed papers allowing him to see his daughter only once a week for 2 hours, so Carol Lynn could have a normal life. But his schedule made him miss 42 out of 52 visits in a single year. In the end, he withdrew on his own. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he couldn't endure the torture of appearing and disappearing like the same wound being cut open again and again. Janice lost her youth. Kenny sentenced himself. He traded a family for a stage, the first deep cut that no spotlight could ever repair. Kenny walked out of his first marriage like a man ripped away from his own roof. No more child's voice in the room, no more smell of meals, no one waiting for him to come home. What remained was the guitar, the night roads, and a familiar sting. If he stopped moving, he would have to face failure head on. Kenny didn't recover from Janice. He ran. He ran into work, into schedules, into becoming the kind of man who was always busy. And in that emptiness, Jean appeared like an escape. Jean didn't enter Kenny's life with glamour. She entered with what he was missing, a home with someone in it, a voice that asked how his day was, a softness that men often mistake for the promise that everything will be okay. At that point, Kenny was no longer calm enough to tell the difference between love and the need to be saved. He didn't want to enter marriage. He wanted to step out of loneliness. On October 3, 1960, Kenny married Jean in a church in Houston. The wedding happened fast, almost like an operation meant to put his life back on the right track. Not the joyful rush of two people who believe in the future, but the feeling of a man forcing himself to become stable. And the cruel part was, the mismatch didn't need time to reveal itself. After only a few hours sharing the same room, Kenny already felt the coldness of a rushed choice. Jean did nothing wrong, but she saw it early. The man in front of her didn't belong to a home. He belonged to music, and to the anxiety clawing inside his chest. In their house, the silence wasn't because they had nothing left to say. It was because every question led to an uncomfortable answer. Jean wanted a husband who was present. Kenny wanted a place to return to, but he didn't know how to stay. Kenny went out to perform. Jean stood in the kitchen listening to the clock, understanding she was living with a man who was always outside the door. Kenny came home exhausted, irritated by being questioned because even he couldn't promise when. That marriage slowly became like a coat worn to satisfy social expectations rather than a love that could breathe. On April 24, 1963, they separated in a way so strange it felt chilling. No fights over money, no moral war, no dramatic tearing each other apart. The only thing they argued over, according to Kenny, was a 13-inch black and white television. Jean took it. Kenny walked away. A marriage left his life with a small click, but it left behind a brutal truth. People can marry in search of shelter and walk out even lonelier than they were before. Right then, Kenny's life bent again. No smoother, only more dangerous. Margot Anderson arrived unlike Jean. Margot came from a world of order, a Texas socialite, raised in a family culture where the future is something you see through plans, not promises. Kenny was the opposite, a musician still fighting to survive, unstable money, oversized pride. That contrast pulled them together like two magnets. Kenny saw Margot as the clean light he needed, while Margot saw Kenny as a man with fire, the kind of fire that makes a young woman believe love is strong enough to tame it. They moved fast, and this time, everything was accelerated by a reality they couldn't avoid. Margot was pregnant. Kenny faced the pressure he had already failed once before. He had to become a real family man. On October 15, 1963, Kenny married Margot with a quiet vow to never repeat Janice. Never repeat Jean. With Margot, Kenny didn't feel the immediate sense of wrongness, but in exchange came something heavier: responsibility. On May 24, 1964, Kenneth Ray Rogers Jr. was born. Kenny held his son, looked at that tiny face, and in that moment he understood. This was no longer about romance. This was about a human life. But the irony was brutal. Just as Kenny became a father, the doors of music began opening wider. That year, Kenny was out on the road 280 nights. Margot was home with a newborn, while Kenny ran from studio to club, hotel to stage. Kenny didn't disappear out of irresponsibility. He disappeared because he believed it was the only way to provide for the family. And that is the bloody paradox of men who live with a dream. They leave to save the home. But the more they leave, the more the home collapses. Margot wasn't the kind of woman who sat and cried. She didn't make a scene, but she forced Kenny to look straight at the cost. She kept every diaper receipt and sent them directly to Kenny's tour accountant, like a cold slap. There is no glory here, only milk, diapers, and nights when the baby burns with fever. Kenny remembered it not because of money, but because it dragged him down from the stage to the ground. Kenny didn't betray Margot through loud affairs. He betrayed her by being absent from the small things. Dinner at the table, a child's crying, the moments when a family needs a man to simply stay. The more famous Kenny became, the lonelier Margot became. The more chances Kenny gained, the more Margot felt she was being turned into the keeper of the house for a man who only passed through. They kept going on duty more than love. Kenny sent money and rushed apologies. Margot kept the household running and swallowed the resentment. That marriage didn't die in a single blow. It wore down day by day, the kind of wearing down where no one sees blood until everyone is exhausted. And when the first edition collapsed, Kenny threw himself into solo work like a final gamble, a schedule of 210 shows a year. In the first 4 months of 1975, he was home for only 16 nights, enough for Margot to understand. This wasn't a marriage, it was empty space on a calendar. Margot filed for divorce in April 1975. No further accusations were needed because the schedule itself was the indictment. On July 15, 1975, the marriage ended, leaving Kenny with a painful truth. He could do everything to become the artist the world loved, but he still never learned how to stay as a husband. Under that dizzy, relentless pace, Kenny met Mary Ann Gordon, a television girl with a bright smile and the calm composure of someone used to standing in front of a camera. Mary Ann wasn't dazzled by the name, at least not at first. She was drawn to the man behind it. The seasoned look in his eyes, the easy charm in his conversation, the kind of energy that makes people believe the future is opening up. The relationship moved quickly, the way Kenny always lived. Little caution, lots of decisions. Mary Ann arrived just as his fame was beginning to take shape, and she thought she had found a man ready to settle down. Kenny wanted to believe that too. The marriage felt like a promise of self-rescue. He needed a home to hold him back, and she believed she was gentle enough to pull him out of a drifting life. Then Christopher Cody Rogers was born, binding them even tighter. For Mary Ann, the baby was the dream of a family. For Kenny, it was both happiness and pressure, because he had missed so much of his first child's early years that the more he held this baby, the softer he became, and the more afraid he felt, as if staying home meant stepping away from the stage. Mary Ann needed him to be present as a real father, while Kenny was pulled into an endless routine of touring, recording, and television appearances, coming home exhausted, physically there but mentally still on the road. The conflict didn't explode. It seeped in slowly. Mary Ann came to understand she couldn't compete with music. Kenny didn't betray her through affairs, but through absence. She became the keeper of the home, while he lived like a man passing through. The bigger his fame grew, the more her pain was locked inside silence, while Kenny stayed trapped between the legend outside the door and the husband who never learned how to stay inside the house. When the marriage cracked, it cracked like glass. No loud break, only a day when they realized they had lived beside each other too long without being able to truly touch each other anymore. Kenny remained decent, and Mary Ann didn't turn it into a war. But the injury stayed intact, because she had once believed she could hold a man who belonged to a different road, while Kenny carried yet another familiar failure. He could make the whole world believe in songs about family, but when he turned away from the microphone, he was still awkward and helpless when it came to simply staying. In that exhausted state, Kenny's life opened into a new chapter. In 1992, at a quiet Italian restaurant in Atlanta, he went out for an arranged meetup. Yet his eyes stopped on a young waitress named Wanda Miller. Wanda didn't have the sharp, polished aura of Hollywood, and she didn't carry that show business scent. She felt like the normal life Kenny had been missing for too long. Real living, no stage, no schedule, no applause. He left his phone number. Wanda threw it away. One moment that said everything. She wasn't blinded by fame, and for the first time, Kenny met a woman who didn't require him to perform trustworthiness. That very distance made him slow down. Wanda eventually called back not because of celebrity, but because she was curious about an older man with lonely eyes. They didn't rush into marriage. Nearly 5 years of getting to know each other allowed Wanda to see what lay behind the legend. a man accustomed to being loved by crowds, yet clumsy when forced to live inside real love. The public clung to them because of the age gap. Even Wanda's parents struggled to accept it, and the cruelest part was that they were younger than Kenny. Wanda stood between two sides, and she chose to set a condition for the future. If she was going to be with him, she needed him in her life, not just his name. On June 1st, 1997, Kenny married Wanda at his ranch in Athens, Georgia. The wedding felt like a vow to himself. Life cannot be measured only in show counts and applause. Kenny promised to slow down, no longer doing 200 nights a year. For Wanda, it wasn't a pretty sentence. It was a survival rule, because marriage to Kenny could only exist if the stage stood behind the family. Their life together wasn't a fairy tale. Wanda was young and needed a husband who was there, while Kenny was older and carried the instinct that leaving is safer than staying. Public pressure still simmered under the surface, especially when people looked at Wanda as the young girl who married a legend. But she endured quietly. No arguing, no performing perfection. Just stubbornly building a home strong enough that Kenny could no longer use escape as an excuse. For him, it was both comforting and terrifying, because it forced him to face himself every day instead of hiding inside music. In 2004, at the age of 65, Kenny became a father again, with twins Justin and Jordan, an authentic turning point in his life. His earlier children had grown up in distance. Holding two newborn twins, Kenny understood time was no longer wide enough to correct his mistakes. Wanda was much younger than him, but she made him young again in a different sense. Young in learning how to slow down, how to live ordinary life. Kenny tried to make up for the past through family routines, days dedicated to his kids, little jokes repeated until they became rituals. His love with Wanda wasn't built on drama, but on the feeling that for the first time, he was living a life where the spotlight was no longer his only refuge. But peace came with the shadow of age. Wanda looked at Kenny not only as her husband, but as a man moving quickly toward the limit. Each time he grew tired, each time he ached from years of accumulated illness, she understood the true cost of the age gap. She still had many years ahead. Kenny did not. That fear made Wanda hold even tighter to family life, holding on to children's laughter, holding on to reasons for him to stay, holding on to the hope that his final years would not be only remembrance. And Kenny, in that rare stretch of time, finally became a real father, playful but serious, tender but always quietly panicked, because he knew he would not be able to stay with them long enough. When age finally began to slow Kenny down, the first thing to disappear wasn't fame, it was stamina. A man who had lived on tour schedules, on cheers, on going more than staying, suddenly had to relearn the hardest skill of his entire life, stepping away from the spotlight without feeling abandoned. In his final years, his declining health meant he no longer had the strength to keep the old pace. Kenny stopped performing, stepped away from the cycle of interviews, stages, and cameras, and moved into a quieter rhythm in Georgia. A wide ranch, his own private sky, pets, mornings no longer dictated by schedules, and a kind of peace he had missed for half his life. That silence was not failure. It felt like returning home. Kenny spent more time in the house, living the true meaning of being a present father, especially with Wanda and their twin sons. But the body doesn't negotiate. Near the end, he entered hospice care, and on March 20th, 2020, Kenny Rogers passed away at home. The cause was announced as natural causes, at the very moment the world was sinking into a pandemic, making his death feel strangely symbolic. a legend leaving during a time when humanity itself was learning how to accept loss. After that, the story didn't stop at people replaying The Gambler. Kenny reappeared in tribute montages like a cultural landmark. The Grammy in Memoriam segment spoke his name, placing him back where he belonged as an icon, while the family chose a different approach, quieter and more real. In 2021, words of remembrance from his family were shared publicly, a gentle confirmation that behind every legend, there had always been a home that endured too many empty spaces. And then the children who once grew up inside that shadow began reaching adulthood. In 2023, Justin and Jordan spoke with people, mentioning their most private memories like a ritual. Super Saturdays, something they preserved not through photographs, but through repetition, through the feeling of sitting in the same places and going to the same spots, as if they were still holding their father's hand through small routines. And by 2026, another moment surfaced in a rare image that left people quietly shaken. The twins turning 21, a family photo with two identical chocolate cakes, each topped with a single Oreo at the center, Wanda standing behind them. Nothing flashy, just a gentle proof that the man the world once called the Gambler was gone. But the children who carried his name were still moving forward in real life, through their own youth. Kenny Rogers left behind a strange kind of legacy. He didn't just leave songs. He left a type of man, a voice low, warm, unhurried, making millions believe that no matter how brutal life becomes, it can still be retold with decency. In an era when music increasingly tries to win by shouting, Kenny chose to whisper and still made the world stop and listen. He turned country into a language anyone could understand. You didn't have to be born in rural America to feel Lucille, to know the words of The Gambler, or to feel your heart soften in Through the Years. Not because those songs were lofty, but because Kenny had a rare gift. He sang like he was telling the listener's own story. Yet Kenny's greatest legacy isn't measured in 120 million records sold or Grammy trophies. It lies in something harder to quantify. He redefined what a trustworthy star could look like. There was something about Kenny that felt like a man you could sit beside in a late-night bar, listen to him tell a story, and suddenly feel less alone in your own life. That trust wasn't just branding, it was presence. That's why, when he left, the world didn't just lose a singer. It lost the feeling of safety that voice had carried. And yet, while the world believed in that stability, his personal life was a quiet chain of breakage. Kenny taught people how to hold on to love through songs, but it took him until late in life to learn how to stay inside a home. A painful truth, but a human one. Some people are born to be light for everyone else and pay the price by darkening themselves. That's why Kenny Rogers' story isn't merely a success story. It is a long song about the cost of success, about fractured marriages, about children growing up in distance, about regrets no fame can ever buy back. Kenny Rogers moved through life like a true gambler. Not reckless, but someone willing to stake everything for a dream. He won so much, but he also lost the things that hurt the most. And maybe that is why people can't forget him, because beneath the shine of the gambler, Kenny was still only a man, full of scratches, still trying to live with decency until the very end. If you've ever listened to Kenny Rogers, which song do you remember most? The Gambler, Lucille, or Islands in the Stream? And what do you think is the real legacy he left behind? The music, or the life lessons he only truly understood at the end? Leave a comment, and if you want us to keep telling stories like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe.